Eloan had spent 3 years and 11 months making sure this exact moment would never happen. 3 years of a borrowed name in a village so far from the capital that the roads turned to mud long before anyone important bothered to travel them. 3 years of raising two boys who looked too much like their father and pretending the resemblance didn't gut her every single morning. And now, standing in the crowded harvest market of Brindlewood, watching her son Bren vanish into the press of bodies, her blood turned to ice. She had turned her back for 10 seconds. Wizen was still beside her, clutching her skirt with one hand and a sticky honey roll with the other. But Bren, her fearless, reckless, impossibly curious firstborn, was gone. Bren. She kept her voice steady, even as panic clawed up her throat. Bren, come here, right now. The market was louder than she had expected. She had avoided gatherings like this for years, but the winter stores were running dangerously low, and Millcross had nothing left to trade. Brindlewood was the closest market town, half a day's walk through the foothills, and she had told herself it was far enough from the capital. Told herself it was safe. She pushed through the crowd with Eisen on her hip. Now the boy too heavy for this, but too slow on his own legs. Her heart hammered so hard she could taste it at the back of her throat. The market sprawled across the town square in a mess of rough canvas stalls, and the air was thick with roasting chestnuts and crushed herbs and too many wolves packed too close together. Then she heard it, a child laughing. Eloan's head snapped toward the sound. Through a gap between two stalls, she saw him. Bren stood near the far end of the square beside a merchant's overturned crate, grinning up at a man who had crouched down to his level. The man was enormous, even crouching. His shoulders blocked the stall behind him entirely. He wore a dark traveling cloak with the hood pushed back, and his hair was black. And his hand rested on Bren's small shoulder with a gentleness that did not match his size. Everything inside Eloan went still. She knew that profile. She knew those hands. She knew the exact way his jaw squared when he was listening carefully, because she had spent one night memorizing every detail of his face and nearly 4 years trying to burn it from her memory. King Torvain Vale, Alpha of the Ashanmore Pack, ruler of the Northern Territories, father of the two boys. She had kept hidden since before they drew their first breath. He was supposed to be in the capital. He was never supposed to be here. This was a nothing town in the middle of nowhere, and he was crouched in the dirt talking to her son like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Then Torvain went still. She watched the change move through him. The subtle tightening of his posture, the way his fingers curled, almost imperceptibly against Bren's shoulder, his head tilted, the way a wolf's does, when something catches on the wind. His nostrils flared. He leaned closer to the boy and inhaled. Eloan's knees nearly buckled. She knew what he was smelling. Every shifter carried the scent of their bloodline, a signature woven so deep into bone and marrow that no amount of distance or years or pine soap and wild sage could fully erase it. She had scrubbed her sons every single day of their lives trying to mask it. She had kept them far from any wolf who might recognize what lived beneath their skin, but no amount of scrubbing could hide what they were from him. Not from their own father. Not at this distance. Torvain's expression changed. The easy warmth drained from his face, replaced by something raw and stunned and so fierce it looked almost violent. His gray eyes went wide. The same gray eyes that stared back at Eloan from her son's faces every morning. He looked at Bren, really looked at him. And she watched the recognition land like a fist to the chest. Bren was still chattering. Something about a beetle, a rock shaped like a fish. He had no idea who he was talking to, had no idea what was unraveling around him in the space between one breath and the next. Torvain looked up. His gaze swept the crowd with the sharp, predatory focus of a man who had commanded armies, and it found her instantly. Across 30 feet of packed market square, Through the noise and the smoke and the crush of strangers, his eyes locked onto hers. The world stopped. She saw the second wave of recognition hit him, not the boys this time, her. He remembered her. She could see it in the way his lips parted, the way his entire body went rigid, the way something behind his expression cracked open and bled. Eloin grabbed Ison tighter and ran. She didn't think. She shoved through the crowd, dragging her skirt free from grasping hands and market baskets, her only thought a white hot scream tearing through her skull. He knows. He knows. He knows. Behind her, she heard Bren call out, confused and startled, and beneath that, cutting through the chaos of the market, like a blade through silk, she heard the king's voice. One word, just one, her name. Aloin. She almost made it. Aloin reached the far side of the market before the guards closed in. Two of them, appearing from nowhere, their movements practiced and efficient, flanking her before she could process what was happening. She clutched Eisen against her chest and looked for a way through. There wasn't one. Miss. The guard on her left spoke carefully, as if she were something fragile and potentially dangerous at the same time. Please come with us, my son. Eloin choked the words out. My other son is back there. I need my son. The boy is safe, the guard said. He's with His Majesty. Those 4 words hit her like a wall of cold water. He's with His Majesty. Her 3-year-old son was alone with the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and she was being herded like livestock through a market she should never have come to. They brought her to the Merchants' Guild Hall at the far side of the square, a squat stone building that smelled of old ledgers and lamp oil. The guards didn't touch her, didn't restrain her, but their positioning made it clear that leaving wasn't an option. Eisen whimpered against her neck. Mama, where's Bren? He's coming, love. He's coming right now. The door opened. A man stepped inside, tall and lean, with close-cropped hair, the color of aged copper. His bearing was military, his expression was carefully blank. He studied Eloin, then Eisen, and something flickered behind his eyes that he smothered almost instantly. My name is Haddon, he said. I serve as beta to King Torvain. Eloin said nothing. Haddon regarded her for a long moment. Your son is being brought here now. He's unharmed and in excellent spirits. In rather extraordinary spirits, actually. He's been telling the king about a rock shaped like a fish for the better part of 10 minutes, and His Majesty has been listening, with more patience than I've seen him show the entire council combined. Something twisted in Eloin's chest. She couldn't tell if it was fear or something worse. The door opened again. Bren barreled through it, like a small dirt-smeared force of nature, and crashed into her legs. Mama. The big man had a real sword, and he let me touch the handle, and he said I was brave. Behind him, filling the doorway completely, stood Torvain. The room shrank. His presence did that, swallowed the space around him until the air felt thinner and the walls seemed to press inward. He wore his authority the way other men wore armor. But his face was a wreck. Eloin had never seen so many emotions fight for control of a single expression. Fury, grief, hunger, confusion, and beneath all of it, cracking the surface like fault lines through stone, a desperate and furious tenderness that he clearly had no idea what to do with. He stared at Bren, then at Eisen, then at her. Everyone out, he said. His voice was quiet. That made it worse. Haddon hesitated, then ushered the guards from the room and pulled the door shut behind him. The click of the latch sounded impossibly loud. Eloin held both boys against her, one on each side, her arms wrapped around them so tightly they squirmed. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut until the air itself seemed to hum with the strain. How old are they? Torvain asked. 3, Eloin said. Her voice came out thinner than she wanted. She watched him do the math. watched the muscles in his jaw tighten as the timeline resolved itself in his mind, as the single night they had shared almost 4 years ago aligned perfectly with the two small faces staring up at him from behind their mother's skirts. "Their names," he said, not a question. A command. Bren and Eisen. Torvain's eyes closed. A muscle jumped in his temple. When his eyes opened again, they were bright with something he was barely holding back. "Did you know?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "Before today. Did you know they existed?" The look he gave her was so raw, it made her flinch. "No," he said. "I did not." Bren tugged at Eloin's sleeve. "Mama, why is the big man sad?" The question landed in the silence, like a stone dropped into a deep well. Torvain's gaze fell to the boy, and his expression did something complicated and painful, something that stripped away the king and left behind a man staring at a child who had his face and his eyes and his blood, and who he had not known about for the entirety of his short life. He crouched down, slowly, lowering himself to Bren's height. The boy watched him with open, fearless curiosity. Eisen pressed closer against Eloin's leg. "I'm not sad," Torvain said, his voice rough. Bren tilted his head and studied the king's face the way only children can, without pretense or tact. "You look sad," he announced. "Your eyes are doing the thing Mama's eyes do when she thinks we're asleep and she cries." Eloin stopped breathing. Torvain looked up at her. The fury was gone from his face. What remained was worse. It was grief, so clean and sharp it could have cut bone. "We need to talk," he said. "Not in front of the boys," Eloin replied. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping back to Bren, then sliding to Eisen, who was watching him from behind Eloin's hip with wide, wary eyes. Eisen, who was quieter than his brother, who noticed everything and said little, who looked so much like Torvain in the shape of his jaw and the careful way he watched the world that it physically hurt. Torvain reached toward Eisen carefully, the way one might extend a hand toward a wild animal. The boy didn't move, didn't lean in, didn't pull away. He just watched the king's hand with enormous gray eyes and held his breath. Torvain's hand hovered for a moment. Then it dropped back to his side. "Haddon will arrange rooms for you in the keep," Torvain said, rising to his full height. "Tonight. All three of you." "We're not staying," Eloin said instantly. Torvain looked at her. The gentleness evaporated. What replaced it was the king, not the man, but the wolf, the alpha, whose word was law across every mile of territory between the mountains and the sea. "You have kept my sons from me for almost 4 years," he said, each word measured like a blade laid on a scale. "You will stay, and you will explain why." The rooms they were given were absurdly fine. Eloin stood in the center of a chamber that was larger than her entire cottage in Millcross, and tried not to touch anything. The bed was massive, draped in deep blue linens that looked like they cost more than everything she owned combined. A fire already crackled in the hearth. Someone had placed a carved wooden horse and a small stuffed wolf on the bed, and the sight of them made Eloin's chest ache because someone had thought of her boys, had anticipated what children might need, and had done it quickly enough to have the toys waiting before they arrived. Bren discovered the horse immediately and began galloping it across the bedspread while making hoofbeat sounds with his mouth. Eisen sat quietly and held the stuffed wolf against his chest and watched the flames. "Stay here," Eloin told them. "Don't open the door for anyone except me." She found Haddon in the corridor outside. He was leaning against the stone wall with his arms crossed, clearly waiting for her. "Where is the king?" Eloin asked. "In his study. He's asked not to be disturbed." "I wasn't going to disturb him. I was going to leave." Haddon's expression didn't change. "All exits are guarded." Eloin felt the blood drain from her face. "Am I a prisoner?" "You're a guest," Haddon replied, though the word guest had never sounded quite so much like a lock turning. A door opened further down the corridor, and a woman stepped out. She was older, perhaps 60. with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, and the kind of face that suggested she had heard every excuse in existence and believed none of them. Her hands were stained faintly with the purple residue of ground foxglove, and the smell of dried herbs clung to her the way perfume clung to courtiers. "You must be Eloan," the woman said. Her voice was warm but direct, like a fire that gave heat without apology. "I'm Marin, head healer of Ashenmoor. Did the king send you?" "No," Marin said. "I came because there are things you need to understand before you do something reckless." She glanced at Haddon. The beta gave a small nod and walked away without a word, leaving them alone in the dim corridor. Marin gestured toward a stone alcove near the window. They sat on the ledge, and the last of the evening light through the glass turned everything the color of weak honey. "I'll be direct with you," Marin said. "Because I don't think you're the type who appreciates being handled. I'm not." "Good." Marin folded her hands in her lap. "The king is dying." The words hit Elowen in the sternum. Whatever she had expected from this conversation, it was not that what. Not today, not next week, but he is dying, and it has been happening slowly since before your boys were born. Marin held her gaze without flinching. His wolf is fracturing, pulling away from his human self, becoming something separate, something feral. It started roughly 4 months after you disappeared. Elowen felt the floor tilt beneath her. "How do you know when I left?" "Because I'm the one who's been trying to keep him alive since the symptoms began, and the timeline was never difficult to piece together." Marin's voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp as cut glass. "A bond was initiated between you and the king on the night of the autumn equinox. You may not have recognized it at the time. You may have thought it was just attraction, just heat, just one night with a man you wanted. But what happened between you began something that neither of you finished." Elowen opened her mouth. No sound came out. "An unfinished bond is a wound that never closes," Marin continued. "For most wolves, it fades over time. A dull ache they learn to live with, like an old injury that stiffens in the cold. But the king is an alpha. His wolf doesn't let go of anything. And when you vanished carrying his unborn children, his bloodline, the wound didn't fade. It festered." Elowen's hands were trembling in her lap. "What do you mean by fracturing?" "I mean, his wolf is tearing itself free from the man," Marin said plainly. "It started as mood shifts, aggression he couldn't control. Stretches of restlessness that lasted days, where he couldn't sit still or focus or hold a thought long enough to finish a sentence. The council assumed it was stress. They assumed it would pass." She paused, and her composure cracked just slightly. Then the episodes began. Moments where the wolf seizes control completely, and the man simply ceases to exist. He comes back with no memory of what happened while he was gone. They lasted minutes at first, then hours. Elowen pressed her hand over her mouth. "Last month, he lost an entire night," Marin said quietly. "He came back at dawn, covered in blood from a hunt he didn't remember. He'd run 40 miles into the mountains alone and killed a stag with his bare hands and had no memory of any of it. He stood in my infirmary, still covered in blood, and the look on his face told me he wasn't sure it had only been a stag." The room swayed. Elowen gripped the stone beneath her. "We've tried everything," Marin went on. "Every herb in my stores, every technique known to the healers of 7 packs. I consulted scholars, mystics, wolves, 3 times my age, who remembered remedies the rest of us have forgotten. Nothing reaches him. The wolf doesn't want to be contained. It wants what was promised to it and never delivered." "What was promised?" Elowen whispered. "You," Marin said simply. "Its mate, and it seems, its children." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing Elowen had ever carried. "He doesn't know why you left," Marin added after a moment, her voice softer now. "He won't ask." "Because Asking would mean admitting how much your absence has destroyed him, and Torvain would sooner die than let anyone see that kind of weakness, especially you. Elowen stared at her own hands. Her mind was a storm. All this time. He had been fracturing all this time because she had left, because she had believed she was nothing to him, because someone had told her she needed to disappear, and she had believed them, without question. I didn't know, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't know any of this. I believe you, Marin said. But believing you doesn't change the reality. He went to that market today because his wolf dragged him there. He didn't know why. He told Haddon. He felt pulled south, and couldn't explain it. He fought it for 2 days before his wolf overruled him and started walking. A chill crawled down Elowen's spine. His wolf knew you were there before he did, Marin said. And now that he's found you, found all 3 of you, the fracturing will either begin to heal or it will accelerate. There is no middle ground left. From inside the room behind her, Elowen could hear Bren galloping the wooden horse across the bed, and Eisen humming softly to himself. Her boys, her entire world. What happens if it accelerates? Elowen asked. Marin held her gaze, and there was no kindness in her expression now. Only truth. Then the wolf takes over completely, and the man we know doesn't come back. Elowen didn't sleep that night. She lay in the enormous bed, with his sun pressed against each side of her, and stared at the ceiling, and calculated how far she could get before the guards noticed she was gone. The windows were too high. The corridor had 2 men posted at either end. She'd checked. Not far enough. The answer was always not far enough. In the morning, Haddon appeared at her door with breakfast on a wooden tray and an expression that suggested he already knew she'd spent the night plotting escape routes. "The king requests your presence in his study," he said. "The boys can stay with the nursemaid." "No." The word came out harder than she'd intended. "They stay with me." Something shifted in Haddon's face. Understanding, maybe. Or pity, which was worse. "The nursemaid's name is Elspeth. She raised 3 of her own. The boys will be within shouting distance." "They stay with me," Elowen repeated, and her voice cracked on the last word because this was it. This was what she'd been afraid of since the moment Torvain's eyes had found hers across that market square. He was going to take them. He was the king. He had the right, the power, the law, everything. And she had nothing, except the fact that she'd loved them first, and loved them most, and had given up every single thing she had to keep them safe. Haddon studied her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured down the corridor. "Bring them, then." The walk to the king's study felt like the longest corridor in the world. Bren held her left hand and chattered about whether the castle had any frogs. Eisen held her right hand and said nothing. He always knew when something was wrong. He could read a room before he could read a word. The study door was open. Torvaini stood behind a desk covered in maps and correspondence, his jaw tight, his posture rigid. He looked like he hadn't slept either. Dark shadows bruised the hollows beneath his eyes. And when he saw the boys, something crossed his face that was gone before Elowen could name it. Bren broke free from her hand and marched straight up to the desk. "Do you have frogs?" he demanded. Torvain blinked. "What? Frogs? In the castle? Do you have them?" The corner of Torvain's mouth twitched. "I believe there are some in the courtyard fountain. Can I see them? Perhaps later." Torvain's gaze lifted to Elowen, and the almost warmth in his expression hardened into something guarded and official. "Sit down." She sat. Eisen climbed into her lap, immediately pressing his face against her collarbone. Bren was already investigating the items on the king's desk, his small fingers reaching for a brass compass. "Don't touch that," Elowen started. Torvain picked up the compass and handed it to the boy without looking away from her. "It's fine." The gesture was small, almost nothing, but it lodged in Elowen's chest like a splinter. He could have snapped at the child. Could have ordered him to sit still. Instead, he'd given him the compass like it was the most natural thing in the world. and Bren was now spinning the needle with delighted fascination. Marin has explained my condition to you, Torvain said. Not a question, yes, then you understand why I cannot let you leave. Eloin's arms tightened around Eisen. You can't keep us here against our will. I am not trying to keep you prisoner, Torvain said, and his voice held something other than command. Now it held strain. The fracturing responds to proximity, to bloodline. Since you arrived yesterday, I slept for 4 consecutive hours last night. I haven't managed more than 40 minutes at a stretch in over a year. Eloin stared at him. Marin believes the bond between us, incomplete as it is, combined with the boy's presence, creates enough of an anchor to hold my wolf in place, at least temporarily. He paused, and the muscle in his jaw jumped again. I'm asking you to stay. For the boy's sake and for mine. You said I had no choice. I said you would stay. His eyes dropped to the desk. I'm now saying I would prefer it if you chose to. The silence that followed was thick and charged. Bren spun the compass needle. Eisen breathed softly against Eloin's neck. She watched the king stare at his own hands. Hands that had commanded wars and signed death warrants, and 5 minutes ago, handed a brass compass to a 3-year-old boy he'd only just learned existed, and she felt something inside her crack. How close? She asked. Torvain looked up. How close do we need to be for it to work? Eloin clarified. Same building? Same corridor? We don't know yet, he admitted. Marin wants to test the range. She believes the effect is strongest within the same chambers. Eloin's stomach dropped. The same chambers. There are adjoining rooms, Torvain said quickly. A connected suite. A door between them that locks from your side. The fact that he'd specified which side the lock was on did something to her she wasn't prepared for. It was considerate. It was careful. It was the kind of detail a man offered when he understood exactly how frightened the woman across from him was and didn't want to make it worse. Fine, Eloin said. But if either of my sons is uncomfortable for even a moment, we leave. King's orders or not. Torvain held her gaze. Agreed that evening. Eloin stood in the adjoining chamber and stared at the door that connected her rooms to the king's. The lock was heavy iron, and she tested it 3 times before she was satisfied. On the other side, she could hear Torvain moving, the creak of a chair, the rustle of pages, the low murmur of his voice, as Haddon briefed him on something she couldn't make out. Through the thick oak, his presence was a pressure she felt in her chest, steady and warm, and magnetic in a way that terrified her. Bren was already asleep, sprawled across the bed like a starfish. Eisen was watching the door. Mama! Eisen whispered. The man on the other side of the wall. He smells like us. Eloin's heart seized. Does he? Love, she managed. Eisen nodded solemnly. His smell is in my smell. He touched his own chest with his small hand. Right here. Eloin pulled him close and pressed her face into his hair and tried very hard not to cry. A rhythm formed against Eloin's will, and despite her best efforts, mornings belonged to the boys. Bren woke with the sun and immediately began exploring every inch of the castle he was allowed to reach and several inches he was not. He found the courtyard fountain and its frogs on the 2nd day. By the 3rd, the kitchen staff knew him by name and had started saving honey cakes for his arrival, and the head cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Fenella, declared him the most charming menace she'd encountered in 30 years of service. Eisen was different. Eisen moved through the palace like a ghost, quiet and watchful, absorbing everything and offering nothing. He stayed close to Eloin during the day, his hand always reaching for her skirt, or her wrist, or the hem of her sleeve, as if he needed constant proof that she was still there. The king they saw only in the evenings. Torvain returned to his chambers each night after the council sessions ended, and the boys were typically still awake. Bren greeted him without hesitation, launching into reports about the frogs or the kitchen or a crack in the courtyard wall that he was absolutely certain led to a secret tunnel. Torvain listened to all of it. That was the thing that kept catching Ilowin off guard. He didn't dismiss the boy, or redirect him, or offer the kind of practiced, distracted attention that powerful men gave to small children who didn't matter to them. He listened, like Bren's theories, about the secret tunnel where state intelligence, and he asked follow-up questions that made the boy's face light up like a struck match. Eisen kept his distance. He watched the king from behind Aloin's legs, or from the corner of the bed, his gray eyes tracking Torvain's movements with the wary precision of a creature deciding whether to trust something larger than itself. Torvain never pushed. He never reached for Izin, never crouched in front of him, never forced eye contact. He simply existed in the same space and let the boy decide when and if to close the distance. On the fourth night, Elowin woke to the sound of a child's voice on the other side of the door. She sat up, her heart lurching, and realized the connecting door was open. Just a crack, barely 2 inches, but open. She crossed the room on bare feet and pressed her eye to the gap. Bren was sitting on the rug in the king's chambers. Torvain sat across from him, legs crossed, holding a carved chess piece in one hand. He was explaining something in a low voice, something about how the night moved, and Bren was nodding with exaggerated seriousness while holding the piece upside down. But it was Eisen who stopped her breath. Eisen was asleep. He was curled on his side on the rug between them, his stuffed wolf pressed against his chest, his small body angled toward Torvain, with the unconscious trust of a child who felt safe. One of Torvain's hands rested near the boy's back, not touching, just hovering, as if he wanted to make sure Eisen didn't roll too close to the fire. Elowin pressed her hand over her mouth and backed away from the door before they could see her. She sat on her bed and breathed through the ache in her chest. Because this was the thing she'd feared most, and it wasn't what she'd thought. She hadn't been afraid that Torvain would be cruel to her sons. She'd been afraid that he would be exactly this gentle, patient, present. Everything she hadn't been able to give them because she'd been alone and terrified and barely surviving. The guilt was suffocating. 2 days later, she found a small carved frog on the breakfast tray. No note, no explanation. Bren seized it with a shriek of delight, and Elowin glanced toward the connecting door and found it closed. But she could have sworn she heard the faintest exhale on the other side, like someone who'd been listening and was satisfied with the result. One evening, the following week, after the boys had fallen asleep in their room, Elowin found herself sitting in the open doorway between the chambers. She didn't remember deciding to leave the door open. It had simply happened. The way the distance between them had been closing in increments too small to notice, until she looked back and realized she'd moved. Torvain sat at his desk reading. The fire crackled. The silence between them was different, now, less charged, more familiar, like a shared coat they'd both grown used to wearing. "You searched for me," Elowin said. She hadn't meant to say it. The words just fell out. Torvain's pen stopped moving. "Marin told me," she continued, "after I left, you searched." A long pause. He set the pen down carefully, as if it required concentration. "Yes, for how long?" "Elowin?" His voice was low and strained, and carried a warning she couldn't quite interpret. "How long?" she pressed. 7 months. The words came out clipped. "Every tracker I had. Every resource I could spare, without the council realizing what I was doing." The confession hung between them, like smoke. "Why didn't you tell the council?" Elowin asked. His expression shifted into something she'd never seen before. Shame. "Because I didn't know if you'd left by choice," he said. "And if you had, I didn't want the council to know that the woman I'd spent one night with, one single night, had meant enough for her absence to unravel me." Elowin felt the air leave her lungs. She stared at him, and he stared back, and for a moment, neither of them breathed. "I didn't want to leave," she whispered. Torvain's hand clenched on the desk. Then why did you? The truth pressed against her teeth. Someone told me to. Someone told me you were promised to another and that I needed to disappear. But the words wouldn't come, because saying them meant naming the person who'd done it, and she wasn't ready for what would happen when that name entered the room. I was afraid, she said instead, which was also true. Something in his expression softened, just barely, just enough for her to glimpse the man behind the king, the one who had searched for 7 months and never told a soul. Of me? He asked. Of everything, she replied. The fire popped. The silence settled between them, and this time it felt less like distance and more like the space before a bridge. It happened on the 9th night. Aloan woke to a sound she'd never heard before, a sound that bypassed her ears entirely and went straight to the base of her spine, a low, resonant vibration that she felt in her marrow before she understood what it was. A wolf. Not howling. Snarling. She sat up in bed, her pulse slamming. Both boys were asleep beside her, their breathing steady. The sound was coming from the other side of the connecting door. Eloan moved before she thought. She pushed the door open and stepped into the king's chambers, and the air hit her like a wall of heat and fury and wrongness, so thick it made her eyes water. Torvain was on his feet in the center of the room, or what was left of him. His body was caught between forms, muscles shifting beneath skin that rippled and stretched in ways that shouldn't have been possible. His hands had partially shifted, fingers elongated, nails blackened into claws that had gouged deep furrows into the surface of his desk. His eyes were open, but they weren't his. They were gold, solid, and burning, and utterly inhuman, and they were fixed on the far wall with the blank, predatory focus of something that had stopped being a man. Haddon stood by the door, his face white. 2 guards flanked him, both of them pressed against the wall, with their hands up and their bodies angled toward the exit. None of them were looking at the king. They were looking at what the king was becoming. Don't, Haddon said sharply when he saw Eloan. Stay back. She didn't stay back. The wolf's head swung toward her the moment she moved. Those gold eyes locked onto her, and the snarl deepened into something that vibrated through the stone floor beneath her bare feet. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. Every nerve lit up with the primal, ancient terror of a creature facing a predator 10 times its size. She took another step forward. Eloan, stop, Haddon commanded. His voice was tight with controlled fear. When he's like this, he doesn't recognize anyone. He injured 3 guards last month. He won't hurt me, Eloan said. And she didn't know where the certainty came from, but it was absolute. It lived in the same place as the pull, the same place as the ache she'd carried since the night she'd left, the same place where the bond lived, unfinished and starving and refusing to die. She crossed the distance between them, 10 feet, 8, 5. The snarling grew louder with every step. The guards shifted behind her, and she heard one of them draw a blade. Put that away, she said without turning around. 3 feet. The heat radiating off his skin was intense, and she could see the way his muscles trembled with the effort of holding a form that was neither wolf nor man. His claws had curled into fists. His breathing was ragged and harsh and desperate. Torvain, she said, not the king, not your majesty, just his name. The gold eyes found hers. Something moved behind them, something drowning and reaching for air. Eloan reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest. His skin burned, his heartbeat slammed against her palm, fast and irregular and wrong. The muscles beneath her hand were rigid, coiled, caught between 2 forms that were trying to tear apart from each other. Come back, she whispered. The snarl cut off like a severed rope. His body shuddered violently, once, twice, and then the gold in his eyes flickered. Gray bled through from the edges. His claws retracted with a sound like cracking bone, and his hands, his human hands, came up and gripped her wrist, not to push her away. To hold on. His legs gave out. He went to his knees in front of her, and she went with him, both of them kneeling on the cold stone floor. His forehead dropped against her shoulder. His breathing was wrecked, ragged gasps that tore out of him like they'd been trapped for years. She held him. She wrapped her arms around his shaking shoulders and held him while the wolf retreated and the man came back, and behind them, in the doorway, Haddon stood with his hand pressed over his mouth and his eyes bright. Minutes passed. The shaking slowed, his breathing steadied, his grip on her wrist loosened, and his hand slid up her arm to her shoulder, then her neck, his fingers threading into her hair with a desperation that was entirely human. Her name came out broken. "I'm here. The boys," he managed. Are they? They're sleeping. They're fine. You didn't go near them." A sound escaped him that was halfway between a breath and a sob. He pressed his face harder against her shoulder. "How long was I gone?" he asked. "I don't know. A few minutes, maybe more." It felt like hours. His voice was muffled against her skin. "It always feels like hours. I can see everything the wolf does, but I can't stop it. I'm locked behind my own eyes, watching." Eloan's arms tightened around him. The horror of it settled into her bones. Not losing control. Watching yourself lose control. Conscious and helpless and trapped inside your own body. "It's getting worse," he said, and the admission sounded like it cost him something vital. "Faster. The time between episodes is shrinking. Last week, there were 6 days between. This time, 3. She pulled back enough to look at his face. The gold was gone from his eyes, but the fear wasn't. She had never seen the Alpha King look afraid before, and the sight of it cracked something open inside her. "You should take the boys and go," he said. "No, Eloan, I could have hurt them. I could have hurt you." "You didn't. Your wolf came to me. It recognized me." He flinched. "And next time it might not." "It will," she said, her voice fierce. "It came to me because I'm yours and you're mine, and some part of you, even the part that's lost, knows that." The words were out before she could stop them, and the silence that followed was deafening. She watched the impact move across his face, watched him try to armor himself against what she'd just said and fail completely. From the other room, a small voice drifted through the open door. "Mama?" Ison, standing in the doorway, in his nightshirt, clutching the stuffed wolf to his chest, staring at his father, on his knees on the stone floor. Torvine's face contorted. He pulled away from Eloan and turned his head so the boy couldn't see his expression, but Ison crossed the room. Quietly, carefully, with the grave deliberation of a child who understood far more than anyone had told him. He stopped in front of Torvain and looked up at the man who was his father and who was kneeling on the floor with tears on his face. Ison held out the stuffed wolf. "You can borrow him," Ison whispered. "He helps when you're scared." Torvain looked at the toy, looked at his son, and something inside the Alpha King of Ashenmoor broke open and didn't close. After that night, something shifted between them that neither of them named. Eloan stopped locking the connecting door. She told herself it was practical. If another episode happened, she needed to reach him quickly. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying than that. The truth was that the pull had become a physical thing, a constant low hum beneath her skin that intensified when he was near and ached like a bruise when he wasn't. She sensed him now. Through the incomplete bond, like listening to a conversation through a wall. Not words, not thoughts, just impressions. His exhaustion after council sessions that lasted too long. His quiet, fierce concentration when he read reports by firelight. The sudden sharp spike of something warm and aching whenever his gaze landed on the boys. And the hunger, she felt that too. A low, constant current of wanting, that he kept on a leash so tight she could sense the strain of it through the bond. Wanting that flared whenever she entered the room, whenever she tucked her hair behind her ear, whenever she laughed at something Bren said, and the sound carried through the open door between their chambers. he never acted on it. He was careful, almost painfully, so, keeping a measured distance, never touching her, never standing too close. But his eyes followed her the way the tide follows the moon, involuntary and inevitable, and every time she caught him looking, he glanced away a beat too late. Eloan told herself it didn't matter. She was here for the boys. For his condition, not for the way his voice dropped half a register when he said her name, or the way his scent had begun to feel less like a stranger's, and more like something she'd been missing her entire life. Her wolf, dormant and silent for as long as she could remember, had begun to stir. She felt it as a restlessness in her chest at first, then as a warmth that spread through her belly when Torvain was near, then as a desperate clawing need to close the distance between them that took every ounce of willpower she had to resist. It happened on a Tuesday evening. Bren had fallen asleep, face down on the rug in the king's chambers, with a chess knight still clutched in his fist. Eisen was in Eloin's lap, drowsy and warm, and Torvain was reading in the chair by the fire, and the scene was so impossibly domestic that it made her throat tight. She stood to carry Eisen to bed, and stumbled slightly over the rug. Torvain moved without thinking, his hand catching her elbow, steadying her, and the contact sent a jolt through her body that she felt in her teeth. They froze, his hand on her arm, her skin burning beneath his fingers. Eisen sleeping between them. Torvain's eyes dropped to where his fingers gripped her sleeve. His pupils were dilated, and she could see the rapid pulse beating in his throat. His thumb moved, just barely, the smallest stroke, against the inside of her elbow, and the sensation nearly buckled her knees. "Sorry," he said, his voice rough. He released her like her skin had burned him, and stepped back, putting 3 feet of space between them so quickly that the air shifted. Eloin carried Eisen to bed, with her heart slamming against her ribs and the ghost of his touch still branded into her arm. She couldn't sleep that night. Head! She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of Torvaine pacing on the other side of the wall, and her wolf pressed against the underside of her skin, like it was trying to break through. She pressed her face into the pillow and breathed through it, but his scent was in the linens, in the air, in every breath she took. The following morning, she found a drawing tucked under her door. Eisen's work. She recognized his careful, deliberate lines. Immediately. 4 figures standing in front of a square that was probably the castle. A tall, dark-haired figure with broad shoulders. A smaller figure with long hair. And between them, holding both their hands, 2 tiny boys. He had drawn Torvain into their family. Eloin stared at the picture for a long time. Then she pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes. "You're falling for him," Marin observed during one of their sessions in the infirmary. The healer was testing Eloin's blood for markers of the bond's progression, pricking her finger and studying the way it pooled on the white cloth. "I am not, child. Your wolf is practically clawing through your skin every time the man enters a room. You think I can't smell it on you?" Eloin flushed from her neck to her hairline. "It doesn't matter what I feel. He's a king. I'm a weaver who ran away and hid his children from him. That's not a love story, that's a court scandal." Marin raised one eyebrow. "And yet, here you are, sleeping 15 feet from his bed every night, and pretending the door between you is thicker than it is." Eloin had no response to that. That night, she found Torvain in his chambers standing at the window, staring out into the dark with the drawing in his hand. Eisen's drawing. The one with the 4 figures in the castle. He heard her come in and turned. The look on his face stripped every defense she had left. "He drew me," Torvain said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Eisen drew me with you, with them." He traced his finger along the small figures. "No one has ever put me in a picture like this before. Not once in my entire life." Eloin's eyes burned. Her wolf surged forward so hard she gasped. He was close enough now that she could smell him, that deep wood smoke and iron scent that had haunted her dreams for years, and her body swayed toward him without her permission. She watched his throat work as he swallowed, watched his gaze drop to her mouth, and then drag itself back up with visible effort. The air between them had become something tangible, heavy and charged, and thrumming with the same golden thread she felt whenever the bond pulled taut between them. She wanted to touch him. She wanted to press her palm against his chest, the way she had during the episode, and feel his heartbeat steady beneath her hand. And for one suspended moment, standing in the firelight with his son's drawing in his hand and his gray eyes full of everything he refused to say, she almost crossed the room and kissed him. She didn't. But the space between almost and didn't had never felt so thin. 2 nights later, the second episode came, without warning. Eloan woke to the sound of splintering wood and hit the floor running before her mind caught up with her legs. She shoved through the connecting door and found chaos. The desk was destroyed, the chair lay in pieces against the far wall. Torvain stood in the center of the wreckage, fully shifted this time, his massive wolf form taking up half the chamber. His fur was black, streaked with silver at the muzzle, and his eyes blazed gold. A deep, continuous growl rolled from his chest like distant thunder. Haddon was pinned against the door. Blood ran from a gash above his eyebrow. 2 guards lay crumpled by the window, conscious but not moving. Torvain, the wolf's head swung toward her. The growl faltered. Gold eyes found hers, and she saw it again. The flicker of recognition, the man drowning behind the animal's gaze. She reached for him, then Bren screamed. Bren stood in the doorway behind her. Eyes huge, face white with terror, staring at the enormous wolf that filled the room. Eisen was behind him, silent, gripping his brother's nightshirt with both fists. The wolf lunged, not at the boys. Toward them, the difference was impossible to read in the moment, and Eloan threw herself between the wolf and her children on pure instinct. Her arms spread wide, her back to the animal, shielding them with her body. "Don't!" she cried out. The wolf stopped. Its massive head hovered inches from her back, hot breath washing over her neck. She could hear the rough, desperate panting, could sense through the bond a tangle of emotions so violent they nearly knocked her flat. Not aggression, recognition, need. The wolf wasn't attacking. It was trying to reach its children. But the boys didn't know that. Bren was sobbing, his face buried in Eloan's stomach. Izen was frozen, his mouth open in a silent scream. Eloan turned slowly, keeping the boys behind her. The wolf stood trembling, its gold eyes locked on the 2 small faces peering around her legs. A sound came from its throat, low and keening and full of an anguish so raw it didn't sound like an animal at all. Then the wolf retreated. It pulled back, shrank, and Torvain collapsed onto the stone floor in human form, shaking violently, his hands over his face. The silence that followed was the worst sound Eloan had ever heard. She saw what it did to him, even through the haze of shock. The way his whole body folded inward, shoulders curving, spine bending, as if the weight of what had just happened was physically crushing him into the floor. His hands were shaking against his face, and through the bond she felt something so devastating. It nearly brought her to her knees. Not rage, not pain. Disgust. He was disgusted with himself. Every instinct screamed at her to cross the room and hold him the way she had after the first episode. But Bren was sobbing against her stomach, and Eisen was a rigid, frozen weight in her arms. And her children came first. They always came first. She gathered the boys and carried them back through the connecting door. Bren wouldn't stop crying. Eisen wouldn't start. She held them both and rocked them and whispered the same words over and over until her voice went hoarse, until Bren's sobs turned to hiccups, until Eisen's rigid body finally softened against her chest. When they were asleep, she went back to the connecting door. It was closed. From the other side, she heard nothing. No movement, no breathing. Just the vast, terrible silence of a man who had just watched his children look at him with fear. In the morning, Torvain summoned Haddon and Marin and spoke 3 sentences. Prepare the southern estate. Eloin and the boys leave at first light. No arguments. Eloin found out from Haddon, not from Torvain himself. The king refused to see her. She went to his door anyway and knocked until her knuckles ached. No answer. She pressed her forehead against the wood and felt the bond stretching between them, tight with pain, and willed him to open it. He didn't. He won't change his mind, Haddon said quietly. I've known him 20 years. This is the voice he uses when something is finished. Eloin stood in their chambers and packed the boys' things with numb, mechanical hands. Bren sat on the bed, silent, in a way that was so wrong, it made her chest ache, clutching the brass compass Torvain had given him that first day in the study. Eisen held his stuffed wolf, the one he'd offered to the king. Torvain had returned it sometime during the night, placed outside their door without a sound. Why can't we stay? Bren asked, his voice small and confused and stripped of every ounce of his usual brightness. She pulled him close and pressed her lips to his hair, and said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't break. The carriage was waiting in the courtyard at dawn. Lowen carried a sleeping Eisen down the stairs, while Bren walked beside her, clutching the compass in one hand and her skirt in the other. At the bottom of the staircase, she paused and looked back up toward the king's chambers. A shadow moved behind the window. He was watching them leave. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to tell him that sending them away wouldn't protect them from the pain he was so afraid of causing, because the pain of leaving was already worse than anything his wolf could do. But the shadow pulled back from the glass, and the window went dark, and the carriage door closed behind her, with a sound like a coffin lid. The southern estate was beautiful, and Eloin hated every stone of it. 3 weeks passed. The rooms were warm, the gardens were lush, the staff was kind, and all of it felt like a cage lined with silk. Bren stopped talking on the 5th day. Not entirely, not about everything, but the bright, ceaseless chatter that had defined him since he'd first learned words simply dried up. He sat by windows and stared toward the north with his brass compass open in his lap, turning the needle toward home over and over again. He stopped asking about frogs. He stopped asking about anything. Eisen, who had always been the quiet one, became something worse. He became still. He stopped drawing, stopped humming. He sat with his stuffed wolf and watched the door as if waiting for someone who wasn't coming, and the look in his gray eyes was the same hollow absence Eloin saw in her own reflection every morning. Something was wrong with the boys. Something beyond sadness, beyond homesickness, beyond the ordinary grief of a child who'd lost something precious. This was deeper, physical. On the 9th day, Bren woke screaming from a nightmare, his small body rigid, his eyes flashing gold for a split second before the color vanished. Eloin saw it, and her blood went cold. On the 12th day, Eisen growled in his sleep. Not a child imitating an animal, a real growl, deep and resonant and wrong coming from a 3-year-old's throat. The nursemaid who heard it fled the room in tears. Their wolves were waking. Too early, too fast, too violently. And without their father's presence to anchor the bloodline, the awakening was happening the same way Torvain's fracturing had. Without control, without an anchor, without anything to hold them together. Eloin held them through it, held them through the nightmares and the growling and the terrifying moments when her children's eyes flickered gold and their small bodies ran hotter than any child's should. She sang to them in the dark songs she barely remembered from her own childhood in the weaver's shop, and she pressed her mouth against their hair and promised them things she had no power to deliver, that everything would be all right, that they were safe, that the ache in their chests would stop. But it didn't stop. It got worse. Bren stopped eating on the 14th day. He would sit at the table and push his food around the plate with the same blank, distant expression that Eloin had seen on the faces of wolves who were giving up. He was 3 years old, and he was giving up, and the sight of it was the thing that finally broke her. Elowen sent for Marin. The healer arrived on the 15th day, took one look at the boys, and the color drained from her face. She examined them both with quick, practiced hands, checking their eyes, their pulse, the heat of their skin. When she finished, she sat back and pressed her fingers to her temples and said nothing for a very long time. The bloodline bond is fracturing in them too, Marin said finally. It's a cascade. The father's wolf is unstable, and because the family bond was never completed, the instability is passing down to the children. Their wolves are trying to surface before their bodies are ready. If this continues, the shift will happen before their bones are strong enough to survive it. Can you stop it? Not without their father. Marin's voice was tight. They need proximity to his wolf. They need the family bond completed and sealed. Without it, this will not stop. Elowen felt a fury so clean and sharp, it burned away every other emotion. He sent us away to protect them. He's killing them, Marin said, and the words fell like stones. Elowen stood. We're going back. He won't allow it. I don't care what he allows. My sons are dying. They traveled through the night. Elowen held both boys against her in the carriage, wrapped in blankets, their small bodies too warm, their breathing too shallow. Bren hadn't spoken a word in days. Eisen's fingers were clenched so tightly around his stuffed wolf that his knuckles had gone white. They reached the palace at dawn. Haddon met them at the gate, his face grave. You shouldn't be here. Where is he? Elowen demanded. It's gotten worse, Haddon said. Much worse. The episodes are happening daily now. Sometimes twice. He barely comes back. He paused, and she saw something she'd never seen in the beta's face before. Fear. There's something else you need to know. He led her to Marin's infirmary. Inside, seated at the work table with her hands folded and her expression rigid, sat a woman Elowen recognized instantly. Lady Sarin, Torvain's aunt. The woman who had stood in Elowen's doorway all those years ago, with an envelope of money and a voice like ice, and said the words that had sent her running. What is she doing here? Elowen's voice came out dangerous. She came forward on her own, Haddon said carefully. 3 days ago, when it became clear the king might not survive. Sarin looked at Elowen. There was no warmth in her face, but there was something else. Something that might have been regret, though it wore it poorly. I told you the king was betrothed to Councillor Aldrich's daughter, Sarin said. That was true. The alliance was in negotiation. You told me to disappear. I told you that a low-born Omega, carrying unmarked heirs, would destroy a political alliance that had taken 2 years to build and could have prevented a border war. Sarin's voice was steady, but her hands, Elowen noticed, were trembling against the tabletop. I believed I was protecting the kingdom. You were protecting your own position, Elowen shot back. Perhaps, Sarin admitted. Perhaps both. It doesn't matter now. She looked at Haddon, then back at Elowen. He broke the betrothal 3 weeks after you vanished, refused to go through with it. Councillor Aldrich's daughter married elsewhere within the year. The alliance I was trying to protect collapsed the moment you left because you were the only thing holding Torvain together, and without you, he began to fall apart. The silence in the infirmary was suffocating. I was wrong, Sarin said. The words sounded like they had been dragged from her by force. And now my nephew is dying because of what I did. Elowen stared at her. The rage was a living thing in her chest. Years of hiding. Years of poverty and fear and loneliness. Years of her boys growing up without a father. Of Bren asking why other children had 2 parents and he only had one. Of Eisen watching the road with those old patient eyes and waiting for someone he'd never met. All because this woman had decided she knew what was best. The urge to scream was almost overwhelming. Part of her ached to reach across the table and shake this woman until every piece of careful composure crumbled, and she understood, truly understood, what she had taken. not just a mate from a king or a father from two boys. She had taken from Eloan the one night in her entire life when someone had looked at her like she was worth staying for, and she had told her it meant nothing. But behind the rage, beneath it, she felt something else. The bond pulsing in her chest, urgent and desperate, pulling her toward the chambers above them, where Torvain was locked in a battle he was losing. She turned to Haddon. "Take me to him." Haddon led her through the upper corridors. The palace was quiet, in the way that living things are quiet. When they're afraid, every servant pressed against the walls, every door closed, every voice a whisper. The boys were with Marin. Eloan had kissed them both, and promised she'd come back, and Bren had looked at her with hollow eyes and said nothing. And that silence was the thing that drove her up the stairs with her jaw set and her fists clenched and a fury in her bones that burned brighter than fear. The door to Torvain's chambers was reinforced with iron bars. 2 guards stood outside, armed and tense. "He's lucid right now," Haddon said, "but it won't last. The windows between episodes are getting shorter." He hesitated. "He told me not to let you in. I need you to know that." "I know. He'll be furious." "I know that too," Haddon nodded once. Then he lifted the bar and opened the door. The chambers were destroyed. Every piece of furniture was shattered or overturned. Claw marks scored the walls from floor to ceiling. The bed was in pieces. The only thing still intact was the window, and Torvain sat beneath it on the bare floor, his back against the stone, his knees drawn up, his head in his hands. He looked up when the door opened. His face was gaunt, the bones sharp beneath his skin, dark circles carved so deep beneath his eyes, they looked like wounds. He'd lost weight, his hands were bandaged, stained with old blood. When he saw her, his expression crumpled. "No," he said. His voice was wrecked. "Eloan. No, I sent you away." She crossed the room and dropped to her knees in front of him. "The boys are fracturing." The words hit him like a physical blow. She watched the blood drain from his face. "Their wolves are waking too early," she continued, her voice shaking, "because the family bond was never sealed. Because you sent us away and the separation is killing them the same way it's killing you. That's not possible." His voice was barely a whisper. "Bren hasn't spoken in 12 days, Torvain. 12 days, my boy, who never stops talking, hasn't said a single word." And Eisen growled in his sleep. A real growl, from a real wolf, inside a 3-year-old body, that is not ready for what's happening to it. He flinched like she'd struck him, his hands clenched in his lap, the bandages pulling tight over wounds that hadn't healed. "I was trying to protect them," he said. "If I lose control completely, if the wolf takes over and I hurt them." "You're hurting them now," her voice broke. "You're hurting all of us. Every day we're apart, the bond tears a little more and it takes them with it." He shook his head, his jaw tight. "I can't control what happens during the episodes. I can't guarantee their safety." "You don't have to," Eloan said. She took his bandaged hands in hers, and the contact sent the bond flaring between them. A surge of warmth and pain and desperate aching need that made her gasp. "I can reach your wolf, I've done it before. Let me try again. Let me finish this." "Finish what?" he asked, though she could see in his eyes that he already knew. "The bond. The one we started on the equinox. The one that's been tearing you apart because I left before it was complete." She squeezed his hands. "Let me stay. Let me be yours. Let the boys be yours. Let this be real." His breathing fractured. She felt the war inside him through the bond, the desperate wanting crashing against the wall of fear he'd built so high it had become a prison. "I searched for you for 7 months," he said, his voice raw. "And every single day after I stopped searching, I wished I hadn't. Every morning I woke up alone, and you were the first thing I reached for, like a limb, like breath. I couldn't say your name for a year, because it hurt too much to hear it out loud." He pressed his forehead against their joined hands. "I thought you'd chosen to leave me. And the worst part, Eloan, the worst part was that I understood." Because what kind of life could I offer you? War and politics and a wolf that was eating me alive. I told myself you were better off gone, but my wolf never believed it. Not for a single day. Tears slid down Eloin's face. What if I can't come back next time? He asked. What if the wolf takes me, and I never come back? She cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs tracing the hollows beneath his eyes. Then I'll follow you, she said, and I'll bring you back, as many times as it takes. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, bruising, the kind of kiss that tasted like years of grief and wanting and loneliness poured into a single point of contact. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, and she pressed herself against him and kissed him back with everything she had. The bond roared to life between them. She felt it like a wave crashing through her chest, hot and golden and overwhelming. His wolf surged forward to meet hers, and there was no fracture, no separation, no war, just recognition, just home. He pulled back enough to look at her, his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. If we do this, there's no going back. You'll be bound to me. To all of this, the crown, the pack, the politics. I was bound to you the moment I walked into that market, Eloin said. He kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, his hands sliding to her waist, drawing her into his lap. The world narrowed to the heat of his mouth and the strength of his arms and the sound of his heart beating against hers. When the mating bite came, it was mutual. His teeth found the curve of her neck at the same moment she bit down on his shoulder, and the bond sealed shut with a force that shook through both of them like a bell being struck. Golden warmth flooded her veins, connecting them in a way that went deeper than skin, deeper than blood, all the way down to the place where wolves recognized their mates and called it fate. They held each other on the stone floor of his ruined chambers and breathed together, and for a few perfect suspended minutes the fracturing stopped. His wolf was still, his body was at peace, and Eloin felt, for the first time, since the night she had left him, whole. Then Torvain's body seized. He went rigid against her, his eyes flying open, the gold surging back through the gray, and the snarl that ripped from his throat was deeper and more anguished than anything she'd heard before. The wolf was coming back. Even with the bond sealed, even with her, right here. The fracturing had gone too far. Eloin didn't let go. The gold swallowed his eyes completely. His muscles locked and shifted, the wolf trying to surface. But she held on, her arms around him, her forehead pressed against his, and she followed the bond inward. It was like falling through water. The world dissolved around her, the ruined chambers, the stone floor, the firelight, all of it peeling away like layers of paint, until there was nothing left but darkness and the thread of gold that connected her to him. She followed it. The place she arrived in was a forest, dense, ancient. The trees so tall, their canopy blocked out the sky entirely. The air was thick with the smell of pine and earth, and something metallic like old blood. Only the weight of a silence that had been building for a very long time. And everywhere she looked, there were wolves, hundreds of them, standing between the trees, sitting on roots, lying in the undergrowth. Their eyes reflected no light. They watched her with the patient, resigned stillness of creatures that had been waiting longer than she could imagine. In the center of the forest, in a clearing where the roots of the largest tree erupted from the ground like a throne, sat the wolf, Torvain's wolf. Massive, black-furred, silver at the muzzle. Its gold eyes burned like lanterns in the gloom, and beside it, sitting on the ground with his back against the tree, was a boy. Not Bren, not Eisen, a different boy. Small, perhaps 8 or 9, with black hair and gray eyes full of terror. He was huddled against the tree, with his arms around his knees, and the wolf was curled around him, its great body forming a wall between the child and the forest beyond. Alowan approached slowly, the wolf's head lifted. A low growl rolled through the clearing. "I'm not going to hurt him," Alowan said softly. "I'm not going to hurt either of you." The wolf's growl deepened, but it didn't move. Its body stayed curved around the boy, protective, defensive. The boy watched Alowan with wide eyes. "Who are you?" she asked the child. "I'm him," the boy whispered. "I'm who he was before." Understanding hit Alowan like a wave of cold water. This wasn't a stranger. This was Torvain, the child version of the man she loved, preserved in the wolf's memory, protected in this inner place. "What happened to you?" she asked, kneeling down to his level. The boy's eyes filled with tears. "My father," he said. "His wolf took him. One day he was my father, and then the wolf came. And he was gone, and he never came back." Eloan's breath caught. She looked at the massive wolf, at the way it sheltered the boy, at the hundreds of silent wolves watching from the trees. Not enemies, not the dead, memories. Every fracturing episode, every moment the wolf had taken over, had left an echo here. The wolf wasn't trying to destroy Torvain. It was trying to protect the boy who had watched his own father disappear into the same condition and had spent his entire life terrified that he would follow. "You're afraid," she said to the wolf. "You've been afraid this whole time." Not angry. Afraid? The wolf's gold eyes met hers. The growl faded into silence. "You saw what happened to his father," Eloan continued, her voice thick, "and you've been trying to prevent it. But you can't protect him by separating from him. That's what's causing the fracture. You're pulling away to shield him, and it's tearing you both apart." The boy pressed closer to the wolf. "If the wolf goes away, I'll be alone," he whispered. Like when father left, Aloan felt tears streaming down her face. She reached for the boy's hand. He flinched. Then, slowly, cautiously, let her take it. "I know what it feels like to be left," she said. "I was left, too, on the steps of a weaver's shop when I was 2 days old. No name, no family, no one who chose me." The boy stared at her. "And I spent my whole life believing I wasn't worth choosing," she continued. "That if my own parents didn't want me, no one would. So when someone told me to leave, I left. Because part of me believed I deserved to be alone." The wolf made a sound, low and mournful and aching. "But I was wrong," Eloan said. "And so are you, both of you." She looked at the wolf, then at the boy. "You don't have to choose between being the wolf and being the man. You don't have to protect one from the other. You are the same." She squeezed the boy's hand. "Your father lost himself because he fought his wolf until they broke apart. But you don't have to fight. You have something he didn't." "What?" the boy whispered. "Someone who came to find you," Eloan said. "Someone who's choosing to stay." She reached her other hand toward the wolf. The animal stared at her palm for a long moment. Then it lowered its great head and pressed its muzzle against her skin. The contact was like touching a live wire. Golden light erupted from the point where they met and flooded through the forest. The silent wolves between the trees lifted their heads. The boy gasped. The light spread outward, warm and fierce and impossibly bright, dissolving the shadows, dissolving the fear, dissolving the wall between the wolf and the man. The boy stood, the wolf stood. They looked at each other, and Aloan watched as the child walked forward and pressed his small body against the wolf's chest. The gold light swallowed them both. When it faded, there was only one figure standing in the clearing. Torvain, whole, unbroken. His eyes were gray, shot through with threads of gold that caught the light like veins of ore in stone. He looked at Eloan. Then he broke. She caught him. She held him the way she'd held her sons, through every nightmare, every fever, every dark night in a cold cottage when she'd had nothing to give them but the warmth of her body and the promise that she would never, ever leave. "I've got you," she whispered. "I've got you." The forest dissolved, the wolves faded, and when Eloan opened her eyes, she was back on the floor of the king's chambers with Torvain in her arms, his face buried in her neck, his body shaking with the kind of sobs that come only when something that has been locked away for a lifetime finally breaks free. His eyes, when he finally lifted his head, were clear, gray and gold together. The fracture was gone. The healing was not immediate. Eloan had never expected it to be. Torvain still flinched in his sleep sometimes. He still woke in the dark and reached for her with desperate hands, needing proof that she was there, that the bond was real, that the wolf inside him was quiet and whole. She was always there. She always would be. The boys healed faster than anyone predicted. Bren spoke his first word in 13 days, on the morning after the bond was sealed. He walked into the breakfast hall, looked at Torvain sitting at the head of the table, and said, "Can I see the frogs today?" Torvain laughed. It was the first time the court had heard their king laugh in years, and the sound rippled through the hall like sunlight through water. Eason took longer. He was cautious by nature, and trust, once tested, rebuilt itself slowly in a child who noticed everything. But one evening, as Torvain sat reading by the fire, Eisen climbed into his lap without a word. He settled against his father's chest, tucked his head beneath Torvain's chin, and closed his eyes. Torvain didn't move. He didn't breathe. He held the book in one hand and wrapped the other arm around his son, and Elwyn watched his eyes fill and his jaw clench as he fought to hold himself together. Later, when both boys were asleep, he pulled her close in the darkness of their shared chambers and pressed his mouth against her hair. "He called me father today," Torvain murmured, "when you weren't in the room." He said it very quietly, like he was testing how the word felt. Eloan smiled against his chest. How did it feel? He was quiet for a long moment, like everything. The court adjusted, the way courts always do, with gossip and resistance and eventually grudging acceptance. A nameless weaver, as the Alpha Queen, was not what anyone had envisioned. But the king's wolf was whole. The heirs were acknowledged, and the woman who had brought Torvain back from dissolution was not someone anyone cared to argue with, least of all the king himself. Lady Saren departed the court without ceremony. Eloan did not forgive her. Perhaps she would. Someday, in the distant, abstract way. People forgive storms for the damage they cause, but not yet. On a morning some months later, Eloan woke to pale light and the sound of Bran explaining to Eisen, in his most authoritative voice, that frogs could definitely be trained to carry messages if you were patient enough. Torvain was still asleep beside her. His breathing was deep and even. One arm was draped over her waist, and his hand rested against her stomach, where a new heartbeat had just begun to make itself known. She hadn't told him yet. She would, soon. But for now, she lay in the quiet morning light, with her family around her, and the bond humming, warm and golden in her chest, and she let herself have this stillness, this completeness, this proof that some things, once broken, could be made whole again. Not the same as before, better,